I'm Ilyce Glink. I'm a syndicated columnist. I've met many of you many times over the years. Somebody actually called me out for having attended NARI in 1994, and actually that was the year that my first book was published. I know, right? It seems like 1,000 years ago. Many of you weren't even born yet, or that's what I say to my kids.
What is this thing called a book?
That's the problem. So we do have some very successful book authors here, and Sherry Coons is in the other room. I just saw her, and I think she's written 400 of them now. So anyway, Rick Sharga, he and I sit here every year. Maybe you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Good to see everybody, the familiar faces, and see some new faces here as well. Rick Sharga. I'm the founder and CEO of the CJ Packer Company. We're a market intelligence firm for real estate and mortgage companies, providing them either industry information they can use for internal analysis and business strategy, or taking their data, proprietary data, out to market on their behalf. Prior to this, I've had executive positions at Adam Data, Realty Track, Auction.com, and Carrington Mortgage Holdings. So yeah,
And when I'm not doing this, I'm the CEO of a financial wellness company called Best Money Moves, which you may have heard something about over the course of time. We thought we'd start today. Our talk is the most clever thing we can think of to put as a title on short notice with Ralph. But what we thought we would do is touch all of those topics and a few others. So we're going to start with a little recap of what we said last year at this, whenever it was, where was it last year? Oh, Atlanta. Nice room in Atlanta. So I said last year that 2022 was the year of never befores, right? We had never before seen interest rates go up so much. And now we're seeing some more of the results of that. We had never before seen property prices go up at the same time that mortgage interest rates went up. What was one of your favorite never befores from last year?
well, you actually stole it. It's the mortgage increase. We've never, and this is according to Freddie Mac, we've never in the history of the United States had mortgage rates double in a calendar year until last year. And not only did they double in a calendar year, they doubled in the space of a couple months. So that meant for the average home buyer, their monthly mortgage payment was going to go up depending on where they were in the country, between 45 and 60%. Most of us didn't get a 45% raise last year, so it made affordability a bit of an issue for a lot of people. So that was my big never before from last year.
Yeah, it was really kind of remarkable. And if you remember, 100% of economists said this year we'd be in a recession.
That's not exactly true.
97?
Yeah, 97.6, and that's one of the 37% of all statistics that are made up on the fly.
That's right.
Most of the economists that I follow, it'll be interesting to see what the ones coming to speak later at the conference have to say, but most of the ones I follow still believe it's more likely than not that we'll hit a recession before the end of the year. They keep pushing the timing out, but I look at two historic data points that suggest to me that we're likely to see a recession at the end of the Fed activity. One is that every time since World War II that they've increased the Fed funds rate in order to get inflation under control, 8 of the 11 times they've done it, they've steered us into a recession. And all 8 of them had something in common. It was that they waited until inflation got too high or too entrenched, and then they started raising the Fed funds rate. They've already admitted that they kind of missed their window this time, waited too long, they underestimated how severe inflation was going to be. And the other, and you guys all covered this, I'm sure, is the yield curve inversion.
Yeah.
The last 7 times we've had a recession, there was a yield curve inversion preceding it. I don't see any particular reason why this won't be the 8th time in a row. And it's been a fairly deep and fairly sustained yield curve inversion. It doesn't appear to be getting in any danger of reversing course anytime soon.
Yeah, of course, you can always say that eventually we have a recession. So eventually everybody's going to be right. But the question is when. We've got some other numbers that we'll talk about just a little later on that it kind of point to maybe the fractures beginning. Consumer spending, things that we didn't have before, like buy now, pay later, where you're seeing 21% of all Americans use buy now, pay later, and there's a substantial number of those who are starting to default on those.
You're seeing that. You're seeing auto loans delinquency rates go up pretty significantly, which is not a shock. There's a lot of subprime lending going on in the auto industry for a couple of years. Mortgage delinquencies, interestingly, have come down, and that's particularly true in the seriously delinquent loans. So that doesn't seem to be something that's festering out there.
Yeah, no, and the reason, of course, is because everybody has a ton of equity, because as we said earlier, we've seen property prices grow, sort of, people have a ton of equity.
So that is true. I'm not sure it's the reason for low delinquency rates. I think
No, I meant foreclosures.
we didn't get there yet.
Oh, sorry.
But the delinquency rates are really typically tied into unemployment. And if you look at the NBA's numbers coming out of the first quarter, their delinquency rates overall were 3.56%. Historically, the normal level of mortgage delinquencies is about 4%. So we ended the first quarter below normal levels of delinquencies, and that 3.56% looked awful close to the unemployment rate at the time, which was 3.5%. So it'll be interesting to see as unemployment ticked up most recently at 3.9, if mortgage delinquencies start to follow. But historically, throwing out the Great Recession because it was just an anomaly, but historically you can almost do a direct correlation from unemployment rates to mortgage delinquency rates, and then you can kind of do the calculus about delinquency going into foreclosure and foreclosure, going into bank repossessions. That's where the equity comes in, at least. And this is data from Adam. About 93% of borrowers in foreclosure have positive equity, and they have a lot of positive equity. The last time I looked at the numbers, there were 270,000 people in foreclosure. That's, by the way, about half of what we would normally see in a normal market. But 270,000 people in foreclosure, over 100,000 of them have between 20 and 50% equity. Over 60,000 of them have between 50 and 75% equity. And almost 30,000 of them had over 75% equity. So you're talking about 190,000 out of 270 who have more than 20% equity. And what we're seeing is a higher percentage of people in the early stages of foreclosure leveraging that equity, selling their home in order to make sure they protect it and don't lose the equity at a foreclosure auction. And then we're seeing a very high sell-through rate of properties at the auctions themselves. Almost twice the percentage that we saw prior to the pandemic. So investors who are impacted by this low inventory of homes are finding a way to buy those homes at the auction. So very few bank repossessions. I think that might be a structural change in the distressed property market. Going forward, there's so many loss mitigation programs, so many loan modification programs. FHA announced another one just last week that will help people either avoid a foreclosure entirely, or because there's all this massive equity out there, $28 trillion in homeowner equity, that people are able to escape foreclosure. But it doesn't prevent them from going in. When they go into foreclosure because they lose a job, there's a medical condition, there's a divorce, there's some other financial catastrophe in the household. But I don't see foreclosures being back to 2019 levels probably until the end of this year, maybe the beginning of next year, except in the commercial market.
And we shouldn't understate the obvious, which is that people still have jobs, and 15 years ago, lots of people lost their jobs. So the job market remains insanely strong. You're seeing more people come into it. In fact, numbers were so high last week that it restarted talks of the Fed actually raising interest rates again, as opposed to having a pause at the next meeting, which Rick doesn't think we'll do.
Well, there are a couple head fakes going on in the headlines, and I know that's not because you guys are trying to mislead anybody, but the top line numbers look a little different than what you see underneath. So, for example, there were 339,000 jobs filled in the last report. But if you read down all the way in the bottom of the story, what you found is there were 356,000 people who had started their own businesses, who closed their own businesses, which is probably why the unemployment number went up, even though we had 339,000 jobs created. So I do believe there are probably a lot of people that are kind of churning in that way, because we've had a record number of people start businesses in the last couple of years. So it's just, there are some things that look so positive that you have to really kind of scratch and get underneath the veneer, because they may not be quite as bright and shiny as they look.
So let's talk a little bit about investing and investors and what's going on. There's a whole lot of different categories. We've got fix and flippers. We have people who just watch HGTV and think they can do that. We have office investors. We've got, as we put in our titled Unintentional Investors. So, where do you want to start with the investing circuits? And we're going to give you just some thoughts about how we feel about each of these markets and where we're sort of doing better.
We can start wherever. Why don't we start with fix and flippers, because that's one of the topics we have up there.
Yeah.
This is another one of those headlines that looks really positive until you scratch beneath the surface. So Adam's Q1 report or Q4 report on flippers mentioned that last year was a banner year for flipping. It was up year over year, and that's true until you look at the more recent numbers. And so fix and flip home sales peaked in the first quarter of 2022. 116,000 flips that quarter, which is a record number. What you didn't read was that the subsequent 3 quarters all declined. So there were 115,000 in the second quarter, which was basically flat, but then 94,000 in the third quarter and 80,000 in the fourth quarter. And I would be willing to bet anybody in the room $1 that when the Q1 numbers come out, we'll see another decline. The inventory hasn't been there, the price models are all screwed up, the demand curve for flippers has weakened a bit. The ideal market for a fix and flip investor is a market with low demand, rapidly rising prices, and just an insane amount of demand versus low inventory. We still have low inventory. Prices aren't going up dramatically.
No.
And demand for higher priced homes, because of what we talked about earlier with financing costs, has slowed down a bit. So it's not a desert for flippers, but it's not an ideal environment for them either. And one of the things you can look at, we talked about this a little bit getting ready for today, is the impact on the iBuyers, who
Yes.
effectively were institutional flips. And so, Zillow Offers obviously exited the market last year. If you looked at some of the more recent numbers coming out of, Open Door, their buying activity is plummeted. So that's one of the things that I've noticed. I think we've seen similar reports from the folks at CoreLogic, that the biggest of the investors, the institutional investors, the iBuyers, have really scaled back dramatically. But a lot of the investing going on has been backfilled by small and mid-sized investors who are happy to not be competing with consumers and not be competing with Blackstone.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the category of people who own 3 to 10 properties, they seem to be out there no matter what the interest rate is, and they're picking up properties.
Well, it's funny. Back in 2009, there were roughly 9 million single-family homes being rented out across the country, and nobody had ever heard of them. It was this well-kept secret because it was 9 million mom and pop investments out there, and probably 9 million investors who all own one property. Now there's more than twice that today. There's somewhere between 20 and 21 million single-family homes, and everybody points at the institutional investors, but the fact is the biggest of the investors collectively own about 3% of the inventory. People that own 10 or less still own over 90%. But what those institutions did was create a business model, and they've created followers. So now there's mid-sized investors who maybe focus on a state or even a couple counties within the state. And that's been a fast-growing segment. So this mid-size between mom and pop and Blackstone has been the fastest-growing part of certainly the single-family rental market, and probably even on the flipping side a little bit. And one of the things that I think is today's well-kept secret is that I believe there's still a ton of iBuying going on out there, but it's not going on from the huge national players. I was at a conference in Arizona in December. I was approached by no less than 5 people who are doing iBuying, but they're doing it in a local market. So only working San Diego, only working Arizona, and they're local market experts. So what they have going for them that Zillow and OfferPad and Open Door have struggled with is that local market expertise. They know what a property should trade for, and they have feet on the ground to be able to execute. So I think that happened in the single-family rental market. The big guys came in, got all the ink, but didn't get all the buying. We saw a lot of smaller buyers come in and gobble that up. And I think we're seeing the same thing happen in the iBuying segment.
Yeah. It's also interesting how worried everybody is about their home equity. So My cab driver coming in asked me, when he found out I was here for a real estate conference, asked me if I thought he was going to lose his shirt on his properties. Yours?
I'm not gonna lose my shirt, I hope.
No.
Well, no, so in order to do that, you have to have a pretty significant crash in home prices. And math at the moment suggests the opposite of that. Turned out my Uber driver to the airport was also a commercial real estate broker, and if you're following the commercial market, Susan, you know that there are probably a lot of brokers who are Uber drivers this year. And we were talking about that, and I asked him how far he thought home prices had fallen nationally so far this year. And his guess was about 7 or 8%. So he was a little surprised when I told him that in reality, prices were up 2.7% year over year in May. So I think there's that perception that home sales have slowed down, it's really expensive to finance, and therefore prices must fall. When in fact, all we've really seen so far in most markets across the country is that the rate of appreciation has declined. And historically, by the way, that's also been true. It's a misnomer that as interest rates go up, prices come down. But I think I said this last year, and if not, I should have. But the correction that we're in the middle of right now, and I do think it's a correction, not a crash, is going to be very localized. So if you're where I live in California, coastal California's double digits down year over year in terms of prices. If you're in Boise, Idaho, where prices went up 47% a couple of years ago, they're down double digits. If you're in Austin, if you're in Phoenix, if you're in some of those markets where prices appreciated beyond any rationality, you're seeing those prices come down. Pacific Northwest. If you look at everywhere else in Texas other than Austin, prices are going up. If you look at Florida, prices are going up. Tennessee, the Carolinas. So it really is a very local market correction this year. It's not like the Great Recession where everything went bad. And when I said math suggests the opposite, it was basically because there's a tailwind for real estate on the residential side that's demographically driven. We have the largest cohort of young adults between the ages of 24 and 35 in history. They all want to live somewhere. Research suggests most of them would like to live indoors. As long as that's the case, there's going to be demand for rental properties and owner-occupied properties. And realtors I talk to across the country tell me that when a property today comes to the market priced properly, they're getting multiple bids on it, and it's moving very quickly. So again, there will be some markets that get hit harder than others. Like I mentioned, coastal California, the Bay Area, and even there, if you're at the low end of the market, prices have been protected pretty well. It's when you start getting into the more expensive price tiers that you're seeing a little bit of attrition.
Yeah, I did a quick real estate tour of San Diego a couple of weeks ago, about a month and a half ago. And we went from the city to some of the different neighborhoods in Hillsborough, all the way up to the university, around the university. And I just have to tell you, the prices there are like looking at Boston or New York. It is stunning, stunning, stunning what people are paying for, and price per square foot is, not even for great amenities. Older buildings, apartments that need work, and they're getting $1,000 a foot, $1,300 a foot. And there's nothing to see. There's nothing literally on the market. So
That's why they're getting $1,000.
Of course.
There's nothing to buy.
right, and that's still, so we had this part of our conversation last night. We were talking about how we want you to be careful in your reporting, because there's some things, numbers and ways that these numbers can fool you. So for example, it looks like there's more inventory coming on the market, or there is more inventory on the market. This is Rick's favorite metric, so explain how this one works.
So if you look at, I was looking at Alto's research numbers this morning. They were somewhere in the neighborhood of 430,000 properties available for sale. And that's up 0.7% from last week, and up 10 to 15% from last year, somewhere in that range. And that looks like, great, we're getting inventory coming to market. Except that's not really true. If you look at number of new listings, they're down double digits year over year. So the only reason the inventory numbers look like they're going up, and I see Skylar smiling at this, the only reason inventory numbers are going up is because it's taking longer to sell the properties once they come to market. It's not because more properties are coming to market. So there really isn't much to buy out there. And the fact is that what economists refer to as rate lock is actually taking place. Over 70% of homeowners with a mortgage have a mortgage rate of 4% or lower. So you're sitting on a 2.5%, 3.5% mortgage, you're just not gonna be really excited about selling that property, buying a more expensive one, taking on a 6.5% or 7% mortgage. So difference between existing home sales and new home sales. Those existing homeowners don't need to move, and the ones that are moving are the ones that either have to, or there's an inflection point, some catalyst in their personal lives that's prompting them to move. But new home builders, we're seeing comprise a higher percentage of overall sales than usual for two reasons. One, because they have product available to sell, so it's there. The other is that they're offering concessions. They're paying points to buy down mortgage rates. They're offering price discounts to get vacant inventory off their books so they can recapitalize and move on to the next project. So the market's going to behave a little differently this year than it probably has in years past. And I think while the builders are working through that glut of homes that they had last year, that was one of the numbers we didn't talk about last year.
Yeah.
Last year we hit a peak where we had the highest number of properties under construction in history and the lowest number of new homes completed and available for sale in history. And those two numbers are starting to kind of normalize and get back to more realistic levels.
Yeah, it's really remarkable when you've actually been in this world for 30 years and you're saying never before. I mean, it's truly never before times 4. Let's talk about the office market. We've saved the best for, near the end here. So the office market has tanked because people don't want to go to the office anymore. I gave up my office in 10 years. My employees went home in COVID and said, we're never coming back. And I said, okay, and pocketed the ridiculous amount that I was paying for my, sub-C market space. But anyway, you may have noticed in your own hometowns that there are large office buildings that are vacant or nearly vacant, and lots of different kinds of services and businesses, restaurants, cleaners, things that are going out of business as the waterfall effect of this, what I think is a real change in how people live and work. The emphasis on wellness, so in my financial wellness world, we touch on general health wellness. And when you look at the numbers that come out from places like Mercer, Fidelity does a lot of research in office trends because of their 401k connections. If you look at some of the other wellness trends, what you see is that people are highly resistant to going back, to being forced to go back to the office. The other thing that you don't see quite as clearly, but that we see in the real estate side, is that many companies have downsized their space over the last couple of years. And now, when they're requiring people to come back, there's no place for people to sit. So in Atlanta, some friends of mine at Equifax faced this, where they're now, first they were like, no, you can be remote forever, so of course they all moved to their lake houses full time. And then the CEO's like, no, I decided you should all come back 2 to 3 days a week. And they come back and they literally fight for desk space, and then they're on Zoom anyway. Well, this has just bred a whole lot of discontent, and so the pushback is that offices are vacant. So let's talk a little bit about that vacancy, because it looks like $1.5 trillion of these loans that were securitized, which is a significant portion of the market, are all interest-only loans, and they're due over the next 3 years. And as some of you may know who cover commercial real estate, I'm sure you know this, but if you don't, you may not realize that the value of the building is entirely tied up with what people are paying for space and how full it is. It has very little to do with all the nice shiny toys and things that they put in it. So, guess what? Buildings are vacant, rent's not coming in, the value of the building plummets. Now your loan is due, it was interest only, the $25 million you borrowed is entirely due, and your property's worth maybe $5 or $10 million. What do you think is going to happen? Or what are your thoughts about that?
That's kind of depressing.
Yeah.
So I can tell you in Southern California, commercial sales are down probably about 50% year over year in terms of volume of sales. I know that's definitely hitting the multifamily market. San Francisco vacancy rates downtown in office buildings are somewhere between 40 and 50%. There's an office building in the city that's for sale today for $60 million. It last sold for $280 million. My wife and I were up in LA a couple of weeks ago to see a concert. Spent the next day kind of wandering around the Hollywood area. Cannot tell you the ridiculously high percentage of vacant storefronts there. And I was explaining to her and Ed, my Uber driver yesterday, the waterfall effect we were talking about. Those offices are vacant, which means that the restaurant next door that used to serve all those office workers doesn't have any customers. So the restaurant goes out of business, and the food trucks that, or the food suppliers that supplied that restaurant now took a hit in their business, and on. And as those restaurants and services and other businesses close in the city, now it's less fun to live in the city than it was before because you don't have all the amenities. And so that starts to have an effect of potentially threatening the multifamily market in the cities, in the metro areas. So people refer to it as a doom loop. I think that's probably a good phrase. I think certain cities, San Francisco and LA come to mind. New York's trying to get creative to get out of it, but I know they're fighting the same thing. I will tell you, just taking a look at going back to foreclosures, because I think I'm legally required to talk about that. I've seen that commercial foreclosures are running anywhere from 30 to 40% higher than they normally do. It's a very small number. You're talking about 400, 500 foreclosure actions a month. But it's, compared to it used to be 300, 400 a month. So it's a big difference. And that's true not just in small dollar commercial properties, but it's true in very, very large properties. There was a story yesterday about a mortgage holder for the Park 55 and San Francisco Hilton hotels who announced they're walking away from their $725 million mortgage because it's not in the best interest of their shareholders to keep paying on those properties when they don't even know what they're worth anymore. So we're seeing the Roosevelt Hotel, the Marriott Manhattan East, both went into foreclosure last year. So we're talking about big, prominent, kind of high-profile properties going into foreclosure, and I think we're going to see a lot of distress in the commercial market over the next few years. We were talking about this yesterday, and I was at a conference, and when I think it was BlackRock announced that they just closed their biggest ever fund to buy commercial properties. And somebody elbowed me and said, see, I guess that means the commercial market's not going to be as bad as we think. And I said, no, that means the commercial market's going to be even worse because the big institutional investors don't go raise money to buy properties at the peak of the market. They go raise a lot of money to buy discount properties. And if BlackRock and Blackstone are out raising these funds, that's what they're looking forward to in the years to come. Interestingly, though, to juxtapose, we're not seeing that on the residential side. We're actually seeing the institutions kind of shift gears and go more toward ground-up projects. Build-to-rent is becoming a very popular trend in the single-family rental market. I don't know why they didn't do that earlier. It gives them much more price control, much more quality control, much easier maintenance requirements going forward. But I think we're seeing a lot of the institutions shift gears there. But the commercial market as a whole will struggle a bit. I don't know if anybody's here from RCA or CoStar to talk about this in more detail at the conference. Was that Jim?
Yeah.
Jim does great work. If you're not all following Jim Costello, you should follow him regularly. I'm a big fan. But it will vary by sector. So office is probably the most vulnerable. Retail depends on the type of retail you're talking about. Multifamily, I think demographics will ultimately help multifamily survive without getting tarnished too much. The hotel market, I think, is still a big question mark. So it really, and the industrial market is probably the healthiest of the group, or safest of the group. So it really is going to depend on what part of commercial you're looking at, but Jim will give you all the details of his presentation later.
And I just wanted to, and we'll get to you in a moment, but there was some talk yesterday about how you take, maybe these office buildings and you convert them into residential. Now, in downtown Chicago, there are a number of those conversions that have taken place over the last 20, 30 years. Mayor Daley the Younger had decided that people should live, work, and play all in the city. It was actually, for 35 years ago, that was a pretty remarkable thing for him to decide. And then he took some huge plows and he plowed up the downtown airport so that nobody could land there anymore, and he turned it into a park overnight and middle of the night. So we don't have that kind of leadership anymore in Chicago, probably a good thing. But he did oversee the beginning of the conversion of some of these very old, century-old buildings that were turned into apartment buildings. Now, it came up yesterday, well, if we're gonna have all these vacant buildings, and we have all these people who don't have a place to live, why don't we just match those two things up? Is it, it's garanimals for buildings? And Rick and I talked a little bit about this, Rick, and, I think it's a little bit harder than it sounds. So do you wanna kind of recap that as a fixer-upper sort of thing?
Creative reuse is a great theory, it's a great concept. I kind of made a joke talking to groups over the last few years that at shopping malls, I've seen really incredibly creative reuse of shopping malls. Healthcare facilities and retail and restaurants and even residential. And I always said my mom would have been right after all these years, because when I was a teenager, she said, why don't you just go live at the mall? You spend all your time there anyway. And now I can. But taking these huge office buildings and converting them to residential units sounds good until you start kind of looking at the details. I don't know of a city in the country that says you can have residential units that don't have their own bathroom. Think about the last big office building you were in, and try and count how many bathrooms there were on the floor in that office. So at a minimum, as you're breaking this thing up into units, you're gonna have to create multiple bathrooms. A bit of a problem, a bit of a challenge. Many cities have ordinances that if you're in an owner-occupier or a consumer residence, windows have to open for safety reasons. Most buildings, most more modern buildings don't have windows that open, so now you have to restructure that. So talking to a developer, he said in a lot of cases, if you have the money, it's sometimes cheaper to tear the building down and restart than it is to try and retrofit the building. Not that it's cheap, but it's cheaper. And so there are zoning issues, there's parking issues, there's these kind of functional structural issues. In a lot of cases, some of these older buildings are actually easier to convert than the newer buildings.
Yeah.
What I think we could see, and I think we're starting to see this in LA, is there's a movement toward taking motels and kind of limited service hotels and converting them into low-cost affordable housing, temporary affordable housing. And those are a little easier to convert because they already have a lot of things you need.
Yeah, hotels are a much easier conversion. I mean, just the bathroom-bedroom ratio alone is probably good. All right, so we'll take some questions. Sherry, you were number one. Go ahead.
Actually, excuse me, that was going to be my question about converting. There's so much commercial property, converting it to residential. I bought an apartment in New York that was a educational building, the Board of Education, and they converted it to co-ops. It worked out really, really well, and it seems like just a logical step because there are so many empty commercial buildings in this country.
Yeah, years ago, before I left Philadelphia, there was a movement there to convert old warehouses into condos and apartments, which went extraordinarily well, and they were just gorgeous units. But it really depends on the nature of the building itself and the extensive nature of the reconstruction that needs to go on. And then if you're in the downtown area, you actually do have parking issues as well. And some downtown areas are zoned against high-density housing. So that becomes a real issue if you're going to put people into a 30-story building in large numbers. So there's a lot of zoning issues that go into this as well.
All right, general other questions? Thoughts? Wow, stunned them into silence again. Lou, I can always count on you to get things going.
Rick, can you expand on your well-kept secret concerning the single-family rental market?
Yeah, so, and we're talking about iBuyers here, Lou?
Pardon me?
iBuyers. Oh,
Are you
that's
just
actually
in
fixed.
general renting?
Single family, so the single family rental market, the popular theory is that Wall Street is gobbling up Main Street. So Blackstone, Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, handful of companies are gobbling up all the inventory, making it impossible for first-time buyers to get a house and owning all this rental stock. When in reality, that whole cohort owns between 3 and 3.5% of the single-family rental units out there. Mom and pops, investors who own 10 or fewer, still account for about 90% of single-family rental ownership. The well-kept secret is this middle tier of companies, and Lou, I can't think of many of the names off the top of my head, but you and I can follow up, I can give you some examples. But there's a number of these companies that have sprung up that will own a few hundred or a couple thousand properties. Not the size of an Invitation Home, certainly, but that's the group that's really come in and started to buy up a lot of these assets. They tend to be local market specialists or regional specialists. Some of them aspire to be the next Blackstone, but most of them aspire just to run a profitable business as an owner of multiple properties in their market. Jeff?
A follow-up question to that. So, maybe this time or early 2022, the estimate from John Burns and from CoreLogic was 1 in 5 single-family homes was going to an investor. What's that number now?
Latest number I saw, I'll give you a couple of numbers I can throw around. The latest number I saw, there was a CoreLogic report that came out about a week ago. Said in the first quarter it was 27% based on their definition of an investor. And I believe their definition is anybody who's simultaneously held 3 or more properties over the last 10 years. Adam had some data that came out earlier this year that said that in the first quarter, 45% of homes were either purchased by investors or by cash buyers. NAR numbers, I'm doing this off the top of my head, it was somewhere in the 20s. So, that 1 in 5 number, probably still pretty close. But it depends on your definition of investor, which is why the numbers all get kind of squishy. When I was in Adam, our definition was anybody who purchased 3 properties within a given period of time. That was an investor. Because typically, if you own 1 property, you're not an investor. If you own a second, maybe you have a vacation house or a lake house or something like that. So 3 seemed like a reasonable number. That looks like what CoreLogic uses too. It gets a little fuzzier as you start to figure out how to tier investors. And what really got fuzzy, and I noticed this in the data last year, I don't have a hard number for you, Jeff, but we call them unintentional investors this year. And I think a lot of those cash buyers are actually not investors. They're actually people that tapped into the equity in their existing home to buy a second home. And whether that was to rent it out on a regular basis, to turn it into a short-term rental like an Airbnb, but they didn't want to give up that 2.5% mortgage, but they'd already amassed hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity, and they used that to go buy a second property. Does that make them a real investor? Kind of depends on your definition. But we saw a lot of people with 1 extra property in 2022, which was a little unusual for those kind of buying patterns. You're in charge.
Okay. Back, Eileen, sorry, Sherry, you already got one in.
Okay. So as we see more cities like Boston trying to push, bring back rent control, how do you see that affecting, I always love that question, I can tell. Affecting the market?
Rent control is the most popular failed experiment since socialism. It doesn't do what it set out to do. What temporarily, it prevents rents from going up for a certain cohort of tenants, but it basically shuts down investment activity. And so what you wind up with ultimately is a shortage of rental properties because nobody's building new ones. So I don't think, I think if rent controls are intended to be a short-term Band-Aid in order to keep rental rates from rising dramatically, they kind of have that effect, but in the long run, they tend to backfire. And the reality is, if you look at we didn't get into this, but if you look at rental rates, the company I work with called Beacon that does analysis of single-family and multifamily rental rates based on the listing prices, not the current tenants in place. Multifamily in Q1 this year was up 3.34% from a year ago nationally. That varies market to market. Single-family rents were actually down 2.4%. So the market does have a tendency to help adjust based on demand. But I don't think, rent control, I just don't think is a good solution for anything in the long run. It sounds good, but it really doesn't have an effect.
The better solution is to actually just build more. So the problem with the NIMBY stuff is that, it's all very well and good to build, but just not anywhere near me. So you put the artificial constraint with supply, and then obviously demand is growing, country is growing, right? So people are coming out of their parents' houses, and the brown rabbit continues. And so they don't have anywhere to go. Now, California has made real progress with this, with their accessory dwelling units, ADUs, which Sherry can tell you all about, because she's writing a book about it, or will be, one of these days. But if you look at the numbers over in California, the ADU thing is caught on like wildfire. And across the country, zoning laws are now changing, moving as usual, west to east, when it comes to this stuff, to allow these ADUs so that people will be able to, relieve the pressure. Now, I'm trying to remember the number that I just saw the other day, but I think it's somewhere in the lines of the demand has been eased by something like 20%, 18 to 20% in California. That's probably, I don't know, I have to look at the number, but there is some huge number of these units that have gone in, and that's really helped. Are we getting to the end?
We got the, we're getting the hook.
The hook?
Yeah.
Okay, do we have time for one more question? Who knows? Let's do it anyway. Yeah.
Going back to the single family rental, do you have a percentage of new construction that is built to rent?
The question was, do we have a number for build to rent?
What's the percentage?
What's the percentage?
I can probably get you that. I don't have it. I don't want to make one up on the fly. But yeah, let's follow up and I'll try and get you that number.
Yeah, last year we did a build to rent session. I didn't do it, so I don't have those numbers, but it was one of those things that I think we were trying to highlight as a trend. And it's worth looking at in your area, because when it comes to financing, and I'm not sort of the expert in commercial financing, you should look over there, but financing rental properties is far easier than financing a single family housing development, right? Because you have to pre-sold X number before the bank will agree. Same thing with building a condo building. So everybody builds these, ridiculously expensive rental properties because there they can get the financing from the get-go. But it's causing, that kind of financing issue is going to cause, and has already caused, kind of a shift in how we see homeowners and renters. So it's worth, as you're looking in your own neighborhoods and thinking about stories, to really focus in on this idea of build to rent and what it actually means down the road. All right, so I think Ralph, you out of time? We are. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll be around if you've got questions.